Yeah, I
Interesting.
apologize. I think that was my error. I probably didn't buy the right Zoom plan. I'm
That's what
sorry.
happened. That's right. That's right, because it happened in 40 minutes.
Yeah, that
The
was
basic
probably the
plan
issue.
only gives you 40 minutes. That's right.
Well, I have the
Um,
record on again. This will be part two. How about that?
Good. That's right. So, what was the last question? Oh, yeah. We were talking about trust.
Yes.
So there is trust is it's a crucial issue, because especially in complex societies like our modern ones, it's really important to figure out who you can trust, not just in politics, but sort of in general, in every area of life. And there is a significant amount of literature, both in philosophy and in social psychology, about trust. But at the bottom, it's really commonsensical. I mean, let's forget for a minute, the big questions of, who do I trust about vaccines, or who do I trust about
Right,
climate
right.
change, stuff like that. Forget that for a second. When you have much more mundane problems, such as, oh, my car broke down. Now I have to do what? I have to bring it somewhere to get fixed, right? Well, who do I trust to fix my car? You presumably bring it to a mechanic. Right? You don't go to a dentist with
Right.
your car, or right, or to your priest with a car. You go to the mechanic. Why? Because implicitly you're trusting experts. You recognize expertise. You say, "Look, I don't know enough about car mechanics to fix this thing myself. Therefore, I'm going to go to an expert." But then you also realize that the experts sometimes are not experts. They pretend to be experts.
Right.
So how do you know that that car mechanic is actually an expert? Well, that's why when you enter into an office like a car mechanic, or a doctor, or a dentist, or a lawyer, you usually see certificates, right, of accomplishment. You see that that person has done a course in mechanics, or has done a degree in law, or something
Right.
like that, right? So in other words, you check that. You say, okay, well, do you have the credentials, right? So number one, you go to experts. Number two, however, you check the credentials of the experts. That said, sometimes even real experts with credentials don't necessarily get it right, because they're
True.
human beings, so
Right.
they might fail, right? They might. So what are you looking at? Well, then you look at the record of that expert, right? Did this mechanic have I been to this mechanic before? Has he fixed my car before? Because if it has consistently fixed my car before, then I'm going to go back. If, on the other hand, he failed to, more often than not, to fix my car, then I might look for another mechanic. Well, what if it is the first time you've never been to that mechanic before? Well, then you ask other people, right? You ask your neighbors, you ask your friends, like, hey, can you recommend a mechanic? Or you go to Google and look at the online reviews
Yeah. Yeah.
about that shop, and so on and so forth. In other words, you do, and then you ask questions, right? Even if you've gone through all of these things, you talk to them. You don't just leave the car there.
Right.
You ask questions to the mechanic. You say, okay, well, can you tell me what do you think is wrong with the car? And then you evaluate whether that makes sense to you or not.
Right.
And you can say, okay, great. So what you've done basically there is, number one, you picked an expert. Number two, you made sure that that expert actually is an expert. You checked the credentials. Number three, you looked at the record, the accomplishment record of that expert, either directly or indirectly. And then you sort of question the expert and need to see what kind of answers you get. That's what we do normally. This is common sense. I'm not telling you, it is not rocket
Sure.
science, right? But then you go to things like vaccines or climate change, and then people want to do their own research. Instead of going to the expert, and instead of
Right.
asking
Right.
proper questions about trust. It's like, what do you mean your own research? You're not a climate scientist. You're not a virologist.
These things are very complicated issues. I mean,
They're very complicated.
yeah,
That's
yeah.
right.
Climate
You,
change isn't something you can just
yeah, you can't
off your
just
head.
look it up on Google and find the first couple of things and they say, oh, now I'm an expert
Yeah.
on
Yeah.
climate change or
Exactly.
vaccines, right? So that is what we need to reinforce and to teach people. That is, on the one hand, true, experts are certainly not infallible because they're human beings. And especially if the problem is complicated, such as a pandemic or climate change, those are definitely complex problems, much more complex than fixing your car.
Right.
Right. So experts might be wrong. I mean, it happens, but they're still your best bet by far,
Yeah.
precisely because those are the people who know the most. They spent their entire lives on studying that topic. It's going to take you a lifetime to catch up with them, right? You're not going to do it just with a couple of Google things. So yeah, go ahead.
Do you think that might explain why these concepts, vaccines and climate change and anything that involves something that complicated that experts and scientists really should be taking the lead on, that we tend to politicize it? We could literally cut in half. Go to any Republican, they'll say, "Nah, climate change is sure it's real, but we have nothing to do with it." And then the Democrats will come. It's like, why are you guys getting involved?
Right.
How do we get rid of that?
Well, that's a great question. One of the things that I don't know how we get rid of it, it's going to take time and effort at a societal level and education, of course, is going to be a certain education of the next generation, especially. It's going to be a big part of it. But we have also to remember, it wasn't always like that. The degree of polarization between the two major parties in the United States, it's a recent thing. Political scientists, who are the experts in this particular realm, they've actually tracked, they measure the degree of polarization. And it's clear that this is only in the last few decades. It mostly started in the 90s, mostly, right? So before that, there was no polarization. There was polarization on ideological and political issues, but not on science issues. Republican. It's kind of funny that Republicans currently are the essentially anti-science, party. Although some on the left also have some issues with other aspects of science. But by and large, right now at this particular point in history, in American history, it's certainly the Republican Party that this seems to be by far the most anti-science. But if you go back only a few decades, that wasn't the case. Republicans were in favor of funding university research. The Republicans were in favor of funding, the space race against the Soviets and stuff like that. So this is a recent thing. There is nothing intrinsic in being a Republican or a Democrat that makes you against science or in favor of science. It just happens to be this particular moment in time, and hopefully it will not last much longer. Hopefully we'll get back to some kind of sanity where facts are facts and not just your opinion.
And how to interpret the facts too, how to get them into a broader conceptual framework, not just throw out facts.
Now, we were talking about social media before, and unfortunately social media have been a significant component of why people have come to distrust science, have come to distrust facts. They have come to regard the other side as evil, and so on and so forth. That's because social media make money out of polarization. There's a lot of research that has come out in the last few years that shows that one way to drive up traffic and therefore advertisements dollars into social media is to publish posts that are inherently controversial. People really are suckers for getting angry. They really want to get angry. The invention of the angry button on Facebook has been a game changer for the worst, I think. Engineers at software engineers at Facebook a few years ago figured out that if they allow people to push the angry button, that drives traffic like 10 times more than anything else, because people really get this rush of adrenaline out of getting angry, and they keep doing it. Now, we were talking about the Greco-Romans, and in particular, I mentioned several times the Stoics. Well, the Stoics warned us about this, not about social media, because they didn't know anything about that, but about anger. They said that anger is a destructive human emotion, even when it's justified, even when you'd be right to be angry because there is an injustice. Either you suffered that injustice or somebody else suffered an injustice. To react with anger is a bad idea. Why? Because anger overrides our reason abilities.
Yes. Right.
It interferes with our rational thinking. And we were saying earlier that the two human excellencies, the two human arete, are precisely living pro-socially and acting rationally, reasonably.
Right.
And in fact, the two are connected, because in order to live pro-socially, you have to act reasonably. You have to engage in that kind of cooperative behavior with other people that is actually hampered by.
And do you think that it seems that also comes back to self-discipline with your analogy of going to the gym? I mean, you're not going to want to. It's going to be easier to let the anger go. or
Yes.
let the anger out rather than controlling yourself and
Correct.
wild.
Correct. Temperance
Practice.
or self-control
Yeah.
is one of the four cardinal virtues precisely for that reason, that if we
Mhm.
don't exercise self-control, then we're going to literally lose it.
Right.
And right. And then we're going to, lash out. We're going to throw a temper tantrum. We're not kids anymore. We're not children. So we shouldn't be throwing a temper tantrum if things don't go our way.
Right. Right.
That's just life, right? Sometimes you win, sometimes you lose. Sometimes things go your way, and other times they don't go your way. And there is an upcoming election, as you know, in a few days, and half of the country is going to be really unhappy about whatever the outcome is going to be, right?
Yeah.
But the reality is, sometimes you win, your side wins the election, sometimes they lose. That's the nature of elections, right? This is the way it works. This is the way a democracy works. If you want always the same size winning the election, that we have a name for that. It's called a dictatorship.
Exactly.
And we don't really like that kind of stuff. Whenever you've seen it in the world, it doesn't work very well.
Right. So I want to get to a couple more questions before we run out of time here. I think they're important questions. Is how do you think, throughout history, there's been there's countless of examples of leaders who dismiss or silence those who challenge them. It's not, I think a lot of leaders don't like to be challenged, they don't like to be questioned, and they get defensive and they want to do something to make sure that the mass dissents or whatever the case might be. How should, without violence and without anything kind of major harm happening, how can society respond to that if they feel that they're being silenced or dismissed for just simply being a skeptical and questioning their leaders?
Well, that depends on what form the silencing takes, right? So there are different ways of silencing people or discouraging democratic debate, right? So on the one hand, silencing can be done indirectly by manipulating the educational system. Right. Leaders have a lot of power about how, because they fund the educational system. So that means diversifying, the response there is to diversify the educational system. I am a big believer in public schooling, but at the same time, I'm also a believer in diversity, because diversity of different kinds of educational systems, because that insulates you from control of by one group or one individual. Then there is control of the media. There too, the answer is diversify. That is, you want many media outlets as much as of them independent as possible, which may mean that you might need to put your money where your mouth is and support your local radio or your local television or something like that, or your local newspaper. Because that's important. That's vital for a democracy. And then, of course, there is political suppression. There is manipulating elections. There is going after your opponents at a political level. Fortunately, so far that hasn't happened that much in the United States. But should it happen, should it get worse, then we would actually be sliding toward an autocratic system. And, at some point, things get bad enough that you need to to get in the streets and start vocalizing and start complaining at a more personal, more physical level, right? So there are many different things we can do. We can donate money to certain institutions, certain organizations that work for a more diverse democracy. We can vote. That certainly is the thing to do. We can talk to our neighbors about voting, or about getting politically involved. One of the problems here is that currently, especially in the United States, when we use the word politics, it has almost become a synonym with partisanship. But those are not the same thing. Partisanship means that, I have an ideology and I'm a Democrat or I'm a Republican. That's it. I'm done. That's end of the story. Being involved in politics, the word politics comes from polis, which means society in ancient Greek. Right. A polis was a city-state like Athens or Sparta or something like that. So to be political doesn't mean necessarily to be partisan. It just means getting involved with improving society, and that can be done at the local level as much as at the national level. In fact, it's easier and more effective to do it at the local level. You know, if you try to talk, for instance, to your senator at a national level, or your representative in Congress, good luck. They're not going to have a lot of time to actually talk to individual voters, because they have millions of people that they need to deal with. But at a local level, you know, your school board, or your town council, or even your state senator and representative, those are much more responsive. And so if you actually want to make an impact, talk to them. You know, go and see them, or give money to them. At a local level, we tend to be much more effective than at a national level. So one thing to do if somebody wants to get politically involved is stay away from partisanship as much as possible.
Exactly.
And B, so use your brain. Don't necessarily accept whatever a particular party says you should accept. You know, think for yourself. And B, try to be active in a way that is most efficacious, that it's most effective. And that usually means not national politics, but local politics. Mm-hmm. And local politics becomes national at some point, because these are the people, you know, national politicians usually come from the local at the local level first. They cut their teeth at the local level. So if you can influence them early on in their career, then eventually you will actually have an indirect influence at a national level.
That makes sense. A ripple, yeah. Well, that's a great way to go into my last question here, because I know that we're running out of time. But I really want to get to this one, because I think it's pretty much hits home with me, and I really strongly believe it is that if philosophers were in charge of our country, what do you think might change in the way policies are made and implemented?
Yeah, that's a great question. Of course, as you know, Plato argued that philosophers should be in charge, but we do need to make a distinction here between, you know, what do we mean by philosopher? So if by a philosopher we mean an academic, such as myself, who, you know, teaches philosophy in a university department, no, those are not the kind of people you want in charge, because those are academics. That's not their job, right? They certainly know a lot about very specific areas of expertise, you know, intellectual, academic areas of expertise. But no, those are not the people you want in charge. Trust me, they're not particularly wise. They're not wiser than normal, you know, person outside of academia. What Plato meant was a different type of philosopher in the sense of a lover of wisdom. So somebody who actually practices wisdom, who actually practices becoming a better human being, who practices the virtues. That anybody can be that kind of philosopher. You don't need a degree. You don't need a PhD for doing that, and you don't need an academic appointment for being that kind of philosopher. And in that sense, yes, very much, I think we should have philosophers in charge, because what that means essentially is we would have wise people in charge. You know, people who actually thoughtfully, you know, consider the issues and try to come up with the best answer possible. Well, yeah, who wouldn't want that? Why would you want anybody who is not wise and is not thoughtful deciding things, right? So sometimes around election time, people are asked, you know, which candidate you prefer, and often, surprisingly, I think the answer is, oh, I like this candidate because I can see myself going out and having a beer with him. It's like, dude, that's not the point of being a president. You don't pick somebody you want to go out with. Go out and have a beer with your friends. That's fine. Right. But that's not a characteristic of a president. I want somebody who actually knows his stuff or her stuff, who actually thinks carefully before making decisions, who surrounds themselves of, you know, with good advisors who actually are knowledgeable about issues, because these are the people that make huge decisions for our future and for the future of the planet. So yeah, you do want wise people who are knowledgeable about things, and you know, and if that means philosophers, yes, you want philosophers.
Right. Professor, I can't thank you enough for joining me here. I know that the families are going to really love what you had to say, so I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It was a lot of fun.
Okay. Thanks again. We'll talk to you later.
Yep.
Bye-bye.